Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes.
Today we're going deep on economics in one lesson,
Okay.
which is a classic in the world of economics, written by Henry Hazlitt.
Yeah.
Now, Hazlitt, when he wrote this back in 1946, he really kind of boils it down to a pretty simple idea, and that is that sound economic thinking really just means you got to trace the consequences of any action or policy, not just for one group or in just the immediate future, but for everyone over the long term.
I think that's such a great point and such a deceptively simple yet powerful idea. And he really, he spends the rest of the book sort of unpacking this. And it's really easy to follow because he uses all these clear and vivid examples.
Right.
And so, like, one of the most famous ones is the parable of the broken window.
Yeah, the broken window fallacy.
All right,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And he uses this to illustrate how,
It's so clever because, like, everyone's probably had broken window.
Yeah. At some point, so you can immediately relate.
Yeah.
And then he kind of twists it at the end.
Exactly.
And you're like, oh, wow.
And it just completely changes your perspective because on the surface, it seems like, okay, well, a broken window, that's good for the economy.
More jobs, more work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Creates work for the glazer. They have to come and fix it.
Yeah.
But then, as he so brilliantly points out, that's only part of the story, right?
Right.
Because what we don't see is what that shopkeeper
would have done that money on it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If he hadn't had to fix that window.
Exactly. And so it really highlights the idea that there's no such thing as a free lunch.
Right.
Right. Every action has a cost.
This is fascinating. So Hazlitt, he seems to be saying that there are these unseen consequences to a lot of these, economic actions, and that we need to be aware of them.
Absolutely.
If we really want to understand how the economy works.
And not just the economy as some sort of like abstract thing, but like how our everyday choices and actions fit into that bigger picture.
So how does this like play out in the real world?
Well, he gives a lot of examples throughout the book, but maybe one that's particularly relevant today is his discussion of inflation.
Okay.
So,
because I feel like that's something everyone's talking about these days.
Absolutely. It's a huge issue.
Yeah.
And it's something that, on the surface can be a little bit confusing,
Yeah.
Because it seems like, okay, if prices are going up, maybe that means things are good. The economy's doing well. But
as Hazlitt points out, that's not necessarily the case.
Right.
Because what inflation really represents is a decrease in the purchasing power of money.
Yeah, like your money just doesn't go as far as it used to.
Exactly.
We've all seen that.
Exactly.
At the grocery store, at the pump.
Everywhere.
Yeah. It's like...
That's insidious. It creeps up on you.
It does.
And what Hazlitt argues is that inflation is often the result of government policies.
Okay, how so? What kind of policy?
So when the government prints too much money, or when it engages in excessive spending, it can create this situation where there's more money in circulation, but the amount of goods and services hasn't actually increased.
So too much money chasing too few goods.
Exactly. And that's what leads to those rising prices. Because if everyone has more money to spend, but there's not more stuff to buy, naturally, those prices are going to go up.
That makes sense.
And so, again, this goes back to his main point about seeing the unseen.
Right.
Because on the surface, it might seem like, oh, inflation, well, maybe that's not such a bad thing. Prices are going up. Wages might be going up. They seem good, but...
Right, but it's an illusion.
It's an illusion.
Because your purchasing power is actually going down.
Exactly. So it's really important to look beyond those immediate effects and to think about the long-term consequences.
To see the unseen. Okay, so we've talked about unseen consequences. We've talked about inflation a little bit.
What are some other kind of big ideas that Hazlitt explores in this book?
Well, another key theme that he really hammers home throughout the book is the importance of production.
Production.
Yes, production.
Okay.
And he's very specific about this.
He says that it's not just about, having money or wealth, but about actually creating goods and services that people value.
So like actually making stuff.
Exactly. Making stuff, providing services, things that people want and need.
Okay.
And he argues that a lot of economic problems arise from this misunderstanding, this idea that we can somehow consume our way to prosperity.
Consume our way to prosperity.
Yeah, like if we just spend more money.
Oh, I see.
That will somehow magically make the economy better.
Right.
But as Hazlitt points out, you can't just consume your way to prosperity.
Yeah, and make stuff.
You have to make stuff.
You have to produce things. So, like, what's an example of this? Like, how does this misunderstanding actually play out?
Well, he gives a bunch of examples throughout the book, but I
Yeah.
think one that's really relevant is the idea of government spending as a way to stimulate the economy,
Okay.
right? So this is a very common argument, you
All
know?
right. Like if the government just spends a bunch of money,
Yes,
that'll boost the economy.
exactly. It'll create jobs, it'll get money flowing again. But as Hazlitt points out,
This is another example of seeing the seen and ignoring the unseen.
okay,
Because on the surface, it looks like, yeah, the government's spending money, that's good for the economy.
right.
But what we don't always see is where that money is coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And more importantly,
What it would have been spent on otherwise,
okay,
right? Because that government spending, it has to come from somewhere, right?
yeah, like what are those sources?
So it could come from taxes,
Okay,
which means that that money is being taken away from taxpayers
right.
who could have spent it or invested it in other ways.
So it's like a trade-off.
Exactly. It's always a trade-off.
You're just shifting money around. You're not actually creating more of it.
Exactly. And this is something that Hazlitt emphasizes again and again, is that there's no such thing as a free lunch in economics.
Right.
Every action has a cost. Every policy has a consequence.
So it's not enough to just look at the intended effects of something like government spending.
Right.
You have to look at the unintended consequences as well.
Exactly. And those unintended consequences can often be quite significant.
Yeah, because you were talking about trade-offs, and it seems like a lot of times these economic policies, they end up creating winners and losers.
Absolutely.
Even if that's not the intention.
Right. And sometimes those who lose out are the very people that the policy was designed to help.
Like with the broken window, you know,
Mm.
the shopkeeper. He's the one who ends up worse off.
Right. Exactly.
Even though it seemed like on the surface that breaking the window would be good for the economy.
Exactly. And this is a pattern that we see again and again when we don't think through the full consequences of our actions.
It's like we're so focused on the immediate effects, the things that are right in front of us,
Yeah.
that we miss the bigger picture, the long-term implications.
Exactly. And that's why Hazlitt's book is so important, because it gives us the tools to think more critically about these issues.
To see the unseen.
Exactly. To see the unseen.
So we've talked a bit about government spending. We've touched on inflation.
Yeah.
What are some other examples of, economic fallacies that Hazlitt tackles in the book?
Well, one that I think is really relevant to, our conversations today is the idea of price controls.
Price controls.
Yeah. So this is when the government comes in and sets a maximum or minimum price for a particular good or service.
Okay, so like rent control would be an example of that.
Exactly. Rent control is a classic example, and it's often presented as a way to make housing more affordable.
Right, which seems like a good thing.
Yeah, on the surface, it seems like a great idea.
Especially in places where, the cost of living is really high.
Exactly. But as Hazlitt points out, price controls often have the opposite effect of what's intended.
Really? How so?
Well, if you think about it, when the government sets a price ceiling, let's say on rent, it's essentially saying that landlords cannot charge more than a certain amount.
Okay.
But what happens if that price ceiling is set below the market rate?
Meaning below what landlords would normally be able to charge.
Exactly. What happens is that landlords have less incentive to rent out their properties.
Because they're not making as much money.
Right. And so you might see landlords converting their properties to other uses, like condominiums or Airbnbs.
Oh, I see. So it could actually lead to a decrease in the supply of affordable housing.
Exactly. And that's the irony, right?
Wow.
This policy that's designed to make housing more affordable can actually end up making it more scarce and more expensive.
Because it distorts the natural balance of supply and demand.
Exactly. And we see this time and time again with price controls. Whether it's rent control or price ceilings on gasoline or any other essential good. When the government tries to interfere with the free market, it often creates more problems than it solves.
And it's those unintended consequences, those things that we don't always see right away, that can really come back to bite us.
Exactly.
This is really making me rethink some of my assumptions about how the economy works.
That's what Hazlitt does best. He makes you think.
He certainly does.
And he challenges us to look beyond the surface, to see the unseen.
To see the unseen.
Right. So in a way, it's kind of like that broken window thing again.
Oh, how so?
Well, because when the government spends money, it's not like that money just appears out of thin air.
Right. It has to come from somewhere.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
so even if that spending creates some jobs in the short term, it might also be destroying jobs in other sectors of the economy.
Because that money could have been invested elsewhere.
Exactly. Or it could have been saved, which also contributes to economic growth in the long run.
Okay, so it's about looking at the big picture, considering all the potential uses of those resources.
Precisely. It's about understanding that every economic decision has trade-offs, and that there's no such thing as a free lunch.
This is really eye-opening. Hazlitt has a way of taking these complex economic ideas and making them seem so clear and intuitive.
He really does, and I think that's one of the reasons why Economics in One Lesson has resonated with so many people over the years.
It's a book that challenges you to think differently about the world around you.
Absolutely. It encourages you to question assumptions, to look beyond the surface, and to consider the long-term consequences of your actions.
To see the unseen.
Exactly, to see the unseen. And I think that's a message that's more relevant now than ever.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've all learned a lot today about the importance of sound economic thinking.
Me too.
And how to avoid those common economic fallacies that can lead us astray.
And, the beauty of Hazlitt's book is that it's not just a theoretical treatise.
Right. It's full of real-world examples.
Exactly. He uses these vivid stories and analogies to illustrate his points.
Like the broken window.
Exactly. The broken window. It's something that everyone can understand and relate to.
And it just completely changes your perspective on things.
It does. It makes you realize that economics is not just about numbers and statistics.
Right. It's about people.
It's about people. It's about choices. It's about consequences.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into economics in one lesson.
It was my pleasure.
It's been a fascinating conversation.
It really has.
And I think we've all come away with a deeper understanding of the principles that govern the economic world.
Absolutely.
And to our listeners, if you're looking for a book that will challenge your thinking, deepen your understanding of economics, and equip you to navigate the complexities of today's world, Economics in One Lesson is a must-read.
I highly recommend it.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive into a classic work that shaped the way we think.